And we have a huge range of topics and styles and sensibilities. So, Damyanti, do you have your book? Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll start with Sanjay. Sanjay, if you could just hold up your book. Diamond in My Palm. It's his first novel. It is set halfway in India, halfway in South Africa. And one of the things that makes it unique is that it plumbs very deep history and brings together a lot of history about the mining of diamonds in India and fortunes around diamonds. I'll go this way next. Well, actually, I want to... Damyanti's novel. Which is here? Yes. You Beneath Your Skin is her first novel. This is a very topical work about violence against women, and it is set in contemporary India. I think both of these books are crime stories and might be called thrillers or crime novels, something like that. And then Meenal has written a work of creative nonfiction, Amma's Daughters. It's a work of creative fiction, which is also a sort of memoir, but we will get into the details of that as we talk about it. It's set during the time, the early decades of Indian independence, and it is around the story of her own grandmother, who was a participant in the freedom movement of India. And then we have Parimal, whose memoir, Can Surmount, is a story about the obstacles he has overcome in his own life, and it's an inspirational work, would you say? So we have this great breadth of topics and styles, but what they all have in common is all of them are narrative works. And all of them are set in the world as we know it, a familiar landscape of people and characters, and none of them are speculative fiction in that sense. But as first-time writers, I think you, or not necessarily writers, but writers of narrative pieces, you may have encountered certain challenges in trying to create a narrative. And what I think is interesting about the process of writing, creating narrative, is that it's not necessarily as straightforward as it might seem like, whether you are telling a completely fictional story or whether you are trying to take something of your own life or the lives of people you've known or lives you've read about and create a narrative out of those. So I would like to ask each of you to speak a little bit about your process and maybe talk about the ways in which it surprised you or what challenges you came across. And maybe in what ways using fiction or creative storytelling allowed you to say things you might not otherwise have been able to say, or if you feel that it gave a certain power, if it had a certain role to play in enabling you to say something about the world that you wanted to say, or are there ways in which you might have felt that using creativity allowed you to say something that was as true or even more true than what we normally call nonfiction? So I will start with you, Damyanti. Your first novel, not your first work of fiction, because you are a short story writer, but this novel, You Beneath Your Skin, it deals with a lot of different social issues. For example, it's single motherhood, the challenges of single motherhood, the challenges of raising a special needs child. It talks about the corruptions of privilege and the vulnerability of the poor, and most notably, violence against women. And so my first question is, why did you choose to write a novel about... I know that you are involved with organizations that deal with violence against women. And I'm wondering, why did you choose to write a novel about these things rather than perhaps a journalistic piece or an essay or something like that?
The short answer, can you hear me? Now? Yeah, so the short and simple answer is, well, I didn't choose it. It chose me, like it happens with everything I write. I never really plan anything. I never really say, oh, come on, now this morning I'll write a piece of flash fiction or a short story, or let's start a novel. I just start writing. And it kind of claims its space and becomes what it is, in the sense of each story takes its own kind of space, and this story, particularly You Beneath Your Skin, I didn't even know I was writing a novel. I didn't know I was writing a crime novel. I didn't know I was writing a novel about social issues. I didn't know any of it. It's a bit too loud. Yeah. Yeah. So, is this better? Yeah, you can make out I'm not an author. So basically what happened was I started writing it. It kind of continued to write itself because Anjali was such a complex and layered character, and I realized I was not writing short fiction because very soon it was 20,000 words, so that's not a short story. And then it continued to grow and became a novel, and there were dead bodies in it, and I had a mentor from the Birkbeck University, and she said, well, the dead bodies, there's a police guy looking for somebody who killed, who made this body a dead body. So you're writing a crime novel. I was like, oh yeah, I am writing a crime novel. And later, I never thought of any of the social issues, frankly, in the sense that I didn't want to convey anything. I was just trying to write a story. I was trying to make sense of it. It took me 6 years putting the jigsaw pieces together. And for me, it was mostly after the book was published, the publisher said, you have to talk about your book. And I was like, what do I say about your book? And then I said, then they said, well, you have these issues. You have, this is a book about acid attack. This is a book about, a single mother, and all the issues Usha has very kindly pointed out. They're apparently all there. And I didn't deliberately put them in, but what has happened is over the past 2 months that the book has been published, and I've been kind of all over India, kind of been dragged by the nose by this book. Haven't really quite planned it. It's been a bit of a serendipity. And everywhere women have come up and they've said, especially in the smaller towns or cities, it's been a real ride talking to the younger girls who say, who ask me for life advice and say, what should I say in this circumstance? Violence against women, what do you have to say about this? My brother slapped me, what do I do about this? So that's been a very inspiring journey, and I didn't know, frankly, that this is where it would take me.
So I know, as I mentioned, you work with Project Y and also Stop Acid Attacks. And I'm wondering if particular stories that you have heard from women in this work that you do, if they in some way informed any of the plot points or characters in the novel, and if so, how, or how did you maybe abstract from lives of people you've known or heard about?
So there's no real incident this is the scene which was based on this person, nothing exactly like that. But of course the acid attack scenes are all based on real experiences of real women who've had acid thrown on their faces by their brothers, their fathers, their cousins, in a case a son. So all of these stories are, in a way, there are the voices of all these women in the voice of this one woman who suffers the acid attack in the story. So all the experiences are real. I have been to all the places, like if there is a Safdarjung hospital, I've actually gone there and sat there and spoke to them. I have, for example, gone to an ex-police commissioner and researched the entire, the novel, and I asked asked him, is this possible? हाँ जी हो सकता है, ऐसा तो बिल्कुल possible है, और corruption तो होता रहता है, bribe तो लेते ही हैं. So it was a very shocking experience, but they vetted my story. And SHO, when I went and spoke to him, he said, हाँ मारना तो पड़ता है, you know, you have to hit them. मारोगे नहीं तो सच्चाई कहाँ से निकलेगी? So all of these stories I went and I heard, and of course I spoke to the plastic surgeon who kind of does partially free work for this on these women who are the acid attack survivors. So everything in the novel that's there, like I went to the extent of taking a car and driving from one point to another point, because I was saying, you know, it takes 2 hours to get from here to there, so I wanted to make sure it actually takes 2 hours. So everything else is real. So nowadays when readers read, they say the characters feel very layered and the setting feels very, very authentic to Delhi, but it's not that they are based on one single person, but a kind of chorus of background voices that I've heard over the course of the last 8 or 10 years of volunteer work that I've been doing. The lot of people who have come and told me their stories have kind of, I think, filtered through my subconscious and into the book.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So just to move on to Sanjay. So you've uncovered fascinating stories about diamonds in India. I had no idea that the history of diamond mining is like 3,000 years old in India. That was fascinating. And so in your book, you trace out connections between dealers and fortunes and goings on around the history of diamonds that link Europe and India and Africa, which is great scope. But you, in the past, have written essays and histories and things like that. So I'm wondering, what is it about this material that made you take this deep dive into narrative? Like, why did you feel like you wanted to fictionalize a story? What did you gain from doing that?
Hello, yeah. Thanks, Usha. You in fact asked me to prepare for this question, and I still feel unprepared for the answer because I've still not discovered why I wrote this novel. But I think I'll just tell you how it came about, and I think that might give us all a clue into why it happened. I mean, that's what we're trying to discover. I think as Indians, we are obsessed with history. You heard it yesterday also. Unless you talk about discovery of India, unless you talk of Lord Parshuram, you're not a true Indian. And I think last few years we've really starting to tear each other apart on what you believe as the right version of history from where you have emerged. And then I thought, okay, let me get to the bottom of this. Let me get to where we all started from. So I kept on going one step back. And I did discover that diamonds were always there in whatever sequence, whatever part of our history we looked at. These diamonds were there. I mean, they were the common thread. And then I started looking at what was around the diamonds. And then it was very funny because European history is also tied to diamonds. So I just had to look at the 12 most famous diamonds in the world today. And they are in the Tower of London, they are in the Smithsonian, the Hope Diamond, the Americans, the most, revered piece of diamond with the Americans is the Hope Diamond, which was held by the French. Then it was known as the Tavernier Blue, and Tavernier picked it up from India, from Akbar's court when, he traveled here. He took 6 journeys to India, very carefully drew out each of the diamond and then carried some of them. So my book tells you why even he made those sketches of the diamonds and things like that. So I think that created the story. On top of it, for 10 years, I was lucky to live in South Africa, which is another country which has a long history of diamonds. And they, of course, articulate it very well. They have their, the Kimberley mines, the story of the Kimberley mines, and, the people who funded them and then, exploited the diamonds. The families which went into business, and that brought me that another connection between the two big communities which have traded in diamonds. One of them comes from the Jewish side and the other is our Palanpuri Jains. And that was the funny part. I was asked to fictionalize the names of the two communities. So I said, why? They said, you might get shot if you put these names in. So, they are fictionalized, but there's nothing serious, but it does go into that. So I think it was that getting to the bottom of this story, which I think made me write this. And I did enjoy it because as I realized that I think fiction is what really gives you that scope of, creating, or let us say modeling reality. I otherwise work in artificial intelligence and these kind of things, but people seldom realize that fiction is the only place where you can model reality in as much detail as you want. And I think that is what made me use this medium to express this particular story. So I think that's where I come from. Thank you.
That's interesting. One little follow-up. The history that is contained in it goes all the way back from the times of the Buddha.
Yes.
And the Mughal Empire, and it involves the story, tracing the story of Gandhi and the places he lived. How did you, and you actually say somewhere that this is a story that transposes mythology into history and history into fiction. And so I wondered if you could say a few words about how you used such disparate histories in.
Yeah, I'm now going to, Usha is making me reveal my plot, but please, can you promise you will buy the book?
You don't have to give any spoilers.
And I'll tell you my worst, conundrum which I am in. There are 20 copies there. If you don't buy them, I have to carry those 20 copies. So if some of you buy them, I'll be really very happy. I'll actually even sign them for you. See, the plot, actually I'll reveal it, and it is quite simple. As I explained, the backdrop of the book is the 12 most famous diamonds in the world, and today they are in the Tower of London, and Kremlin has 2 of them, the Louvre has 2 of them, Topkapi Place has 1 of them, there is the Tehran Museum which has 2 of them, like that. So you can know which dynasties looked for them and finally, owned them, etc. Now, there is a Brahmin who has been chronicling the movement of these diamonds, and they find out that it is 166 generations of this Brahmin who've been doing it systematically for the last 3,500 years. So, the origin, the first scene where these diamonds are recorded was when Lord Krishna held it in his hands and showed them to Arjuna in Kurukshetra. And the last time where these diamonds made a public appearance was when Halle Berry wore one of them to the Oscar ceremonies for good luck, and she got the Oscar that day. So all this is chronicled by this Brahmin, and he gets murdered. So now anybody could be the murderer, somebody who had something to do with Lord Krishna, or somebody who had something to do with Halle Berry. So therefore becomes the complication. So I'll be the excerpt, if we have time, I'll read out, which shows the kind of, the confusion, utter confusion with the investigators. What am I supposed to be looking for? That's the story.
I hope your security is waiting outside.
Yes. So that's really how I brought it together, and that's how I used the whole, rich canvas to put together the story of our history, our myths, etc.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to Meenal and a completely different aspect and part of history. Your recent work, Amma's Daughters, is considered a work of a creative nonfiction. It's a kind of memoir, but it's not a personal memoir. Instead, it's you writing the memoir of your mother, which is a very unusual thing to do and a very intriguing strategy. So, and I think that this idea of creative nonfiction and writing your mother's memoir, it adds actually layers of meaning to this idea of creativity or drawing a narrative out of real life. And So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what it means that it is a work of creative nonfiction, and how is that different from a biography, and why did you choose to write in this way instead of writing like complete fiction or a biography, nonfiction?
Thank you, Usha. Much like Damyanti, I wasn't sure what I was doing when I started writing this. So this was a very personal project and a very emotional project. So in 2010, my mother passed away. She was only 64 years old, and she had been battling cancer for the past 6 years of her life. And in a very emotional moment, I had promised to her that there was this one deferred project of hers. She had written 9 books, some in her own field. She was a professor of music, but there were some that were anthologies of her poetry and short stories and so on. But there was this one book that she always said she wants to write, but she never got a chance to write. And this was the book about her parents. Both her parents, her mother and her father, were freedom fighters. And she really wanted to write about them because she thought, as did I, that it was quite unusual for women to be part of the freedom movement in the way that my grandmother was. So, and there in 2010 when she passed away, it was a very emotional, as you can imagine, time for me. And as a very sort of a coping strategy almost, I started writing this book using one of the autobiographies of my grandmother. My grandmother published an autobiography in 1961, and I did have a copy of that. So using that as the starting point, I started writing something. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I was writing something. I was trying to put together a story of my mother's parents as a tribute to my mother. So it was a very strange thing, and I didn't know what was happening, except that there was an outpouring happening. And then it turned into, from a very private project, a very personal project, it turned into a very public historical project, because I started seeing that this was more than just the story about my grandmother. I realized that I'm telling a much larger story. This is a much larger canvas, a much larger context, because the freedom movement was a very big context. And then I did some archival research. I had a lot of sort of private sources. So I had the published autobiography. I had diaries of both my mother and my grandmother. And I used one of my sabbaticals to do archival research. I went to, when you want to do research on a topic in India, where do you go? You go to the British Library. That's where everything is. And it's all curated beautifully, and people are very willing to help you. So that's what I did. I started from the British Library, and I actually got a lot of authentication of these oral histories and these private archival works that I had, like the photographs and other sources that I had. I found the context for, or rather the authentication of those private resources in this archive. But what I also discovered in the process was that how wrong I was in how I understood modern Indian history. I have a master's in modern Indian history, so I thought I understood modern Indian history, but it made me realize, my research made me realize the blind spot that I had, and potentially a lot of us have, about the role of women, the scale of the involvement of ordinary women in modern times. Well, I mean, this is continual, but particularly in the national movement. While I was doing the archival research for my grandmother's authentication of her account, I was coming across all these references of numbers of women and children who were imprisoned since the 1930s. And then eventually I found some sources that actually provided more concrete numbers. Turns out in 1930, there were 80,000 political prisoners because of the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. And almost 18,000 were women and children. So that was the most surprising thing for me, to realize that there was this massive blind spot that, like people often talk about looking at history with one eye closed, but this was proof that we have been looking at history with one eye closed. Because the way we have recorded participation of women in historical movements and moments, not just in India, but anywhere, we often focus on the very elite narrative. So if you were to count stories of women's participation in the Indian freedom movement, you can count, on both your hands the number of women whose stories you really know, right? And they're all, a famous man's wife or daughter or mother or someone, right? They're always connected to a famous man. But there were these hundreds of thousands of ordinary women who essentially made Gandhi's movement into a mass movement. And their stories are erased from our histories. And I have done some academic work, as an academic has to do. Using that archival research, I've questioned this in all historical traditions, both left and right, both East and West. We have not really looked at, we are aware of the fact, at least in the 21st century, we are a little bit more aware of the fact that women are written out of history, but very little has been done to correct it. That's my assessment. So, what could I do? I could keep writing in the peer-reviewed echo chambers, or I could write something that's more accessible, and that's what I chose to do. So why I'm telling you this long story is because the private and the personal and the public, they're all overlapping. And in this project, it was very clear to me that that overlap is important, but it's also important not just for me as a person who's telling a story, who has a family history to share, but also as an academic. If matters of inequality, social justice, etc., are important, I can't just be talking about those issues in journals and other things that are behind paywalls, that are very expensive textbooks, etc. So this became an important motive for me to work on a narrative which was accessible in every way possible. So, and I know that a lot of booksellers don't like me mentioning this, but not only is this book, it is an expensive book for the Indian market, I totally understand that, but that's because it's produced by a university press that actually does pay its staff well. But at the same time, this book is also open source, so it can be downloaded for free. So, for me, access matters a lot, and especially in these times when anti-intellectualism has become a tool of oppression. It's become a tool to demolish and subvert democracy in a way that is really difficult to see, and it's happening across the world. And I feel to counter this kind of post-truth, anti-intellectual environment, we need to be very consciously thinking about access in language, in publication, in the topics that we choose to write on, but also the platforms that we choose to use. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now.
It's all good stuff. So yes, we'll come now. So Parimal, your book is a little bit different because it is actually a memoir of your own life, but in your work you lead trainings and leadership and things like that. And so I'm wondering if writing this memoir the way you have, as sort of a memoir as a book of inspiration, is driven to some degree by your desire to want to motivate people, as that seems to be something that comes naturally to you. But also, even in telling the story of your own life, I mean, there are so many ways, so many different facets or threads you could choose to tell of your own life. So, as this is your first book, if you could speak a little bit about what challenges you had or what surprised you about trying to turn your own life into a story and what the process was like.
Thank you, Usha. Quite frankly, I did not want to write this book. I did not want to. who wants to relive episodes of cancer and blindness? To write it, you have to relive it. And for the longest time, even my neighbors did not know that I was going through chemotherapy repeatedly. I didn't tell them because I didn't want them to ask me, how are you? And then a friend of mine got me an interview with a paper in the in Mumbai, in Mumbai, and as a result of that interview, I got a lot of requests saying you should write this whole thing out, because for us to even read this interview was very inspiring. Quite frankly, I was surprised. If I'm hit with cancer, I have to get myself treated for it. So what is the big deal? Why does it inspire somebody? So to answer your question, I couldn't figure out that this could be inspiring to somebody. Anyway, enough people kept telling me till I decided to sit down and write it. And then a number of things happened. I've had 4 episodes of cancer, 2 of blindness. I've had a cardiac bypass, I'm diabetic, I'm hypertensive. And I have a lot of other stuff which I consider small change. So, people, when they asked me to write, I was a little hesitant. And the way I had coped with this whole thing was to forget. The details were all gone from my mind. Fortunately, from the point of writing the book, I'm a very good record keeper. So I had all my bills and everything from the hospitals and doctors' letters and prescriptions and so on and so forth. So I could get the dates right. But the dates in my head were wrong by 2 years, 4 years. And anyway, I wrote it down. Every time I came to an episode where something serious happened to me, I fell ill. So my mind was rebelling against remembering all this. And today, people around me are telling me, stop writing. This, what I have with me is the revised edition of the book. I've added a 30th chapter to it because I went through one more episode of cancer last year. And they said, please stop writing because this is, it's making you ill. So really, this is what has gone on with it. People have read it and felt great. They've said, we can't believe, a friend of mine actually wrote to me, we had not been in touch for 30 years. And I sent her the book and she wrote to me saying this has to be a work of fiction. One person cannot go through so much. It also brought to the fore, in a sense, my loneliness. Because I've gone through 80 to 90% of all this without my immediate family. So I've driven to chemotherapy sessions, I've driven to immunotherapy sessions, I've come back on my own. So writing about all this, brings it all back up again into your conscious memory. Not pleasant.
Okay. Thank you. So I think we have only 10 minutes left, right? So I don't know if there will be time for everybody to read. So I'm wondering if maybe we should open it up for questions from the audience. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, all of you. It's been really inspiring to hear of the background stories of why you all wrote the books. Mr. Gandhi, I think you are a walking miracle. And what do you attribute your presence? I mean, you're here today with us. It's been a pleasure. What do you think it is due to your faith or good karma? How would you explain?
I have started dabbling in spirituality since the last 4 or 5 years. And in it I found answers which were, mysteries to me earlier. So when something repeatedly keeps happening, although I am of the bent of mind where why me doesn't occur to me. But why is it happening again and again does occur in the mind. And the answer I found in the theory of karma. It's really not a theory at all. It's a principle. The only thing is you see the effect, you don't see the cause. And I find it quite easy to say to myself that I have done some really bad karmas in my past years, in my past lives, not in this life. And those are visiting me right now, but also one step behind every problem that occurs comes a solution. And so I begin my book by writing, I don't believe in miracles, I depend on them. And that has been my good karma. So both are getting, finding expression. And I'm glad that in one life, so much of my, so many of both my karmic accounts are getting cleaned up. I will leave this life a very light person, unless there is more back there which I have done. So,
No, thank you. One more, please, if I may, Mr. Dharwadker. Just a short one. Oh.
We'll discuss it off.
Well, I was going to ask Mr. Dharwadker a question, so maybe we had the same question. So I just wanted to know, Sanjay, are there any other gems or materials or minerals that could have formed the backbone of the story, or is it only diamonds?
Yeah, interesting question. No, it's only diamonds which have kind of, they have been the longest lasting material. And actually this book also has a short kind of section on that. I did ask a couple of geologists and they were able to establish that large amount of those diamonds were actually formed before the Gondwana continents separated out. So the origins of the diamonds in Africa and the ones found in India have a common volcanic base, and that is 75 million years ago. So that is really the kind of the real genesis of, and that's also the story about why South Africa and India, the things they have in common, other than Gandhi and so many other stories. Thanks for asking that question. Very interesting. If I can just add to it, there's one more. There is a kind of red stone, not the ruby, but the spinel. So the largest spinel is again in the Tehran Museum. It was with Jahangir till he was the Emperor of India. And they say that that spinel was part of that ox who was, when Moses went up the mountain to get the 10 commandments and came back and found people worshipping false gods. And this spinel was part of that particular idol. But I think these are just stories. Thank you.
So, Meenal, my name is Rita Chablani. When you say it's a non-fiction, or would you term it a fiction?
It's non-fiction.
Non-fiction. And personal memoir or memoir?
That's a difficult one because I'm not there. It is my mother telling the story of her mother. So it starts with my mother being a 5 or 6 year old girl, and as her life unfolds, she learns about her parents and their involvement in the independence movement. So it's in a narrative form, it's a first person account, but it's in my mother's voice. So what would you call that?
Right, yeah. So then, the story, have you given it a present or a past tense and person? First person or third person?
First person.
First person. So it's
Yes.
I. That's what
Yes.
she's saying about
Yes.
the whole
Yes.
thing. And it's present tense or past tense? Present, I would believe.
So I actually started writing everything in the very present tense. My editor advised against it because when she read it, she realized that there were certain passages, because there's so much back and forth in the storytelling, because there are times when Surekha, who's the narrator, she is hearing stories from her mother or other people about the times and what happened. And it gets a little confusing if you kept the present tense very continuously. So the editor asked me to change it to the past, and I'm very grateful for that. So as a device, I believe that's what works, but I started writing it in the very present tense.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, this is for Damyanti. When you're writing on crime, and especially when you're writing on acid attacks, it's very natural to also get bogged down with the kind of episodes one is narrating, and talking about how people survive acid attacks. So, how did you manage as a writer to not get too overcome or too overwhelmed with everyone's tragedy, and to still maintain an equilibrium to go on writing about it?
Very, very poorly. I kind of spiraled into depression for about 3-4 months. I couldn't write after I started talking to the acid attack survivors, because it was very hard to kind of, when they say, Didi mere liye kuch kar do, they would hold your hand and say, Didi mere liye kuch karo, and then you feel like you should have been some kind of a superwoman or a Wonder Woman and not Damyanti. So you kind of feel very helpless. And the stories are heartrending, because sometimes it is the father who's burnt a 3-year-old, sometimes it is a husband who has burned the vagina of his wife because she is giving birth only to girls. Sometimes it is a 13-year-old girl held down by her cousins in the fields, and acid is poured on her because there's a property dispute between the two brothers. And I know all these women. I mean, I speak to them regularly. And it's very hard, because you have to go back to normal society after meeting these women who are completely shunned. They are taking their lives back, they're claiming it back, but also in some ways they have embraced the identity of a survivor, where they are told, they say, ab to main survivor hoon, pehle to mere life mein kuch nahi tha, earlier there was nothing in my life, now at least I have an identity, I can get an education. So it devastated me to think that we live in a country where a woman has to be burned by acid to consider herself lucky enough to get an education. So it was not easy. Yeah. Usha very kindly says I should mention the organizations, and the organization that works with these women is Stop Acid Attacks, and they do a lot of work with these women, bringing them from rural areas and working for their education. And also I think one of the fundamental things that needs to change in rural India and even urban India, in the urban pockets where the migrant population comes in from rural areas, is education. And that's where the other organization I work with, Project Y, comes in, where they provide after school support for kids. And sadly, due to lack of funds, Thomas Cook just folded, and due to lack of funds now, these schools might shut down. So it's kind of a heartbreak that I'm going through even now. So if you're asking about how I'm coping, I'm not coping at all. It certainly does. And also in India, I think it is it's only an incident like Hyderabad that moves people, sadly, because, and someday I feel even that would be normal, because people get used to, the human endurance has its negative points. Because, for example, when I go down to Delhi, because organizations are based in Delhi, and people say, Aaj weather is very nice and the AQI is 300 and I can't even breathe, and when I'm trying to go and volunteer in the slums, you can't put a mask and go there. So every time I come back and I cannot speak anymore. So the normal in India is changing, and it is changing for the worse, and we've become like frogs in hot water. I think we are going to get cooked before we know it.